We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. We're in the midst of an active wildfire season in a period of record high summer temperatures. Everyone is worried about grid resilience. So this seemed like the right time to run this interview with Julia Hamm. Many of you know her for her role in growing the Smart Electric Power Alliance, or SEPA, from a small to a very large organization. Now she's a partner with the Ad Hoc Group and is focused on resilience technologies. 20 years ago, there was no real market for grid resilience tech. It wasn't a thing. Today, as Julia explains, it spurred a host of new approaches. She tells us about some pretty cool innovations and why it's not always easy for these technology companies to navigate the utility world. Take a listen. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here. I am so happy to be with Julia Hamm today, a well-known name in the energy space. Julia, I was thinking about our conversation today, and I was thinking about the first time I actually met you, which you probably don't remember, but it was back when SEPA and SEIA had done, I think it was their first event together. I don't remember what city it was in. I just remember the two organizations were there doing an event together, and I thought it was so fantastic. It was just a really incredible event. And it just got me thinking about you and your whole career, which has been really interesting. How did you even come to SEPA? Tell me about the start in your journey.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So going back to my days in college, I had no idea what I wanted to do after graduation. And so it turned out that I ended up really falling into the energy industry, not on purpose, just sort of by accident, about a year after graduation. So I had taken a job doing something else and wasn't really enjoying it. So I started looking for other opportunities. And a year out of college, I ended up at the consulting firm that at the time managed SEPA. This was back in 1999. And this was when SEPA was focused on solar specifically and sort of the intersection between utilities and solar. But it was before there really was even a grid-connected solar market in the US. So I fell into it and immediately fell in love with both the renewable side of it, but also the utility side of it. I did that working for the consulting company with SEPA as my client for a couple of years. And then for a variety of reasons decided to leave. And I went to ICF International for a bit. And while I was at ICF, the SEPA board came back and I still had kept in touch with many of the SEPA board members. But one of them called me one day about a year and a half after I had left and said, hey, we're thinking about making a change. We're thinking about no longer working with the consulting company and rather bringing on full-time people to run the organization. And we had this board meeting yesterday and we decided we have two options. Option A is we're going to ask you to come back as the first actual employee of SEPA and you're going to turn this thing around for us. And option B is if you say no, we're going to dissolve the organization.
Oh, no.
And so this is very early in my career. I was at that point 27, wasn't married, didn't have kids. So it was a good time to take a career risk. Honestly, SEPA at that point was really struggling and didn't have a clear path forward. But I really believed in the mission because I had worked with the organization for a number of years as my client. I knew that there was a market opportunity and that there was going to be a growing need for what SEPA was doing in the future. And so there was some of a risk, but not too much. So I decided to come on as the first employee in January of 2004. And spent the next 19 years growing the organization to what it is today.
That's so interesting. I mean, those early days, I can remember like those early 2000s. I remember being at a conference in DC and it was a renewable energy conference, small. But everybody was thrilled because there were people in suits there.
Yeah.
It wasn't even really almost an industry yet. And so here you were starting this organization in this field that was just beginning to take off and it wasn't really certain where it was going to go.
Yeah.
What did SEPA look like when you left?
I left at the end of 22. And yeah, at the time I left, we had just recently hit 50 staff members. Plus, we had back in 2010 spun out the trade show portion of the business. So that's what today RE Plus and RE Plus Events is, the subsidiary, the LLC essentially, that I had spun out of SEPA in partnership with SIA. But SEPA itself, separate from the RE Plus business, was 50 people when I left. And then, yeah, we had 1,200 members maybe, of which 750 were electric utilities, and the rest were a combination of technology companies and state public utility commissions and sort of other stakeholders that were interested in the work that SEPA was doing. And as I mentioned, SEPA started out as being focused on the intersection between utilities and solar, but grew drastically over the 20 years that I was there. And so increasingly, SEPA's scope was expanding originally from just solar to all renewables, and then from all renewables to things including demand response and smart grid, and it had multiple names over the course of the years. But by the time I left, it really was focused on everything related to utilities and decarbonization, but also not just decarbonization, also increasingly a focus on utility resilience issues as well.
Phenomenal. It's just phenomenal. I'm sure you had many, many lessons learned over those years. You know, if you were talking to somebody who was in their 20s like you were at the start, any one or two words of advice you'd give them about growing something like this?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. I mean, one is it took me a really long time to realize that I shouldn't recreate the wheel. And so I spent a lot of time in the early years sort of heads down, even though SEPA technically had existed prior to me taking over. It really was like we were wipe the slate clean and start fresh. So it really was like I was a founder, an entrepreneur founder of a company that happened to be in the form of a nonprofit. But just in terms of like business process and HR and accounting and payroll and all that stuff, like I was heads down and trying to figure it out all myself. And it wasn't until like 8 or 9 years in that I realized there were all of these resources. Like I was not the first one doing this. Many people have started businesses and there's lots of resources, and templates and best practices. And so I think the big lesson learned for me was like, you got to sort of survey the landscape first and realize like what resources are out there to help you be efficient, make progress faster, and avoid spending time and resources recreating the wheel.
Yeah.
So that was a big one for me.
I think that's a common sort of entrepreneurial mistake early on, right? Entrepreneurs try to do it all. They think they need to do every bit of the business. And like you said, there are resources they can turn to take some of that pressure off.
Yeah, again, not rocket science, and lots of people talk about this, but like decisions around what people to surround myself with were so critical to success. What was needed from those people really varied based on sort of where the organization was in its maturity, right? I mean, what was needed in the early days versus what was needed in the later days were very different. And so it was a hard lesson and not an easy thing to do, to both, on one hand, help grow team members as the organization grew and mature, but also sometimes make changes to the team, which is tough when essentially the organization had outgrown what some of those individuals were able to bring to the table.
That's hard. That's really hard. But yeah, like you said, so incredibly necessary. Let me stop to share something I've noticed after years covering electric power. The real story of how the grid is changing hardly ever shows up in a single headline. It's happening piece by piece in microgrids, solar, virtual power plants, and new market models that reshape how electricity works. That's what I track in the Energy Changemakers newsletter. Each week, I break down the most important developments in distributed energy and explain what they mean for the industry and the world. Recent issues have looked at the rise of data center microgrids, controversies over virtual power plants, and why balcony solar shouldn't be ignored. So if you enjoy this podcast and want a clear weekly briefing on where the power system is heading, you can subscribe for free at energychangemakers.com. That's energychangemakers.com. Now let's get back to the conversation. I'm so fascinated by what you're doing now because, at least in my view of it, it looks like it's almost the opposite. because now you're with Ad Hoc Group, you're a partner, and you are focusing on a different kind of business. Now you're looking at, rather than serving utilities, you're focusing more on the entrepreneurs, all these tech companies that are coming up and helping them along. That is such an interesting change. Tell me about why this change.
So the company's been around for 10 years. Our founder and CEO, Jim Kapsis, spent a long time in federal government in a variety of different roles, and then was an early team member at OPower and built the market development and regulatory practice at OPower and was there through both the IPO and then the acquisition by Oracle, and then left to start Ad Hoc because he recognized that startups in the energy space were really going to struggle in this highly regulated utility market if they didn't have the right experts and sort of guidance as their businesses grew. And so that was sort of the premise behind founding Ad Hoc back in 2016. And back when I was running SEPA, OPower was a member. So I had met Jim, I knew Jim, so I've known him for more than a decade and really respected him. And so when I was thinking about what was next after SEPA, Jim was one of the people that I called. So I actually became a senior advisor for Ad Hoc before I even left SEPA and was senior advisor for 2 years before I became a partner 2 years ago. But, honestly, Alyssa, it's actually not that different. To your point, it's not the opposite of what I was doing at SEPA. It's just the other side of the coin. I'm essentially now working with all of the same stakeholders that I was working with at SEPA. The difference is at SEPA, sort of the utilities were the center of our universe. And it was the technology companies and the regulators and all the stakeholders around them that we were helping engage with. And at Ad Hoc, the center of the universe, our clients are the technology companies. And not all of them are startups. About 2/3 of our clients are startups, but 1/3 are larger growth stage and even some public companies. But those companies that are serving the utility industry are the center of our world. I spend probably half of my time in meetings one-on-one with utility executives at all different utilities, just talking to them about, okay, what are your current problems? What technologies are you already using? Where do you see technology gaps? Oh, you have this problem? Have you heard of this company before? Have you heard of this company before? So I spend about half my time just directly engaging with utilities so that I can then better help our clients in those engagements with utilities.
And so, one area that you're looking for help with is resilience.
Yeah.
And I find this fascinating because resilience, I don't know, maybe pre Superstorm Sandy was not anything. It didn't exist really.
Yeah.
Now a whole industry has formed. Tell me about this industry. Like, where did it come from? How US centered is it? Is it still weather and wildfire? Is that still the impetus, or are there other factors coming into play? Cybersecurity?
Yeah, cybersecurity is definitely relevant. Your point is a valid one that this sort of didn't exist as a market segment if we look back a couple of decades ago. And actually, if you talk to the leadership at Florida Power and Light or former leadership at Florida Power and Light, they will tell you that resiliency as a term and as a thing really came about in around 2006, 2007, because that was after Florida had seen in an 18-month period, they were hit with 7 hurricanes. And the system was just really struggling. And so FPL and the other Florida utilities had to begin to think very differently about the design standards for the grid, what technology was needed. You're never going to be able to avoid all outages, right? There's always going to be outages. But how can you reduce the number of outages? And when there are outages, how can you make sure that the system can come back as fast as possible? And so it really was that 2006, 2007 timeframe when FPL started putting together its first resiliency investment plans that this category started developing. And I would definitely say that in the most recent decade, really even shorter, but like since 2017, 2018, I think the category has grown exponentially because of the increasing wildfire risk. Because there's so much urgency around dealing with wildfires, in particular, because wildfires pose a very significant liability risk for most utilities. It's sort of like people talk about sort of this clickbait phrase of like, you're one ignition away from bankruptcy, essentially, right? If a power line or a piece of power equipment causes a fire and causes catastrophic damage, it could ultimately, from a liability standpoint, cause the utility to go to bankruptcy. And so obviously there's lots of sort of policy conversations trying to fix that, but it creates this new sense of urgency around this resilience category. So to your question, I think it's not just about wildfire. It's about all types of extreme weather. It's about extreme temperatures, which aren't even just like moments in time, but also like the highs are getting higher, the lows are getting lower, they're lasting for longer periods of time. So what does that mean in terms of long-term wear on equipment and how frequently you need to be replacing parts of the system, which might be different than the past? But it is also wildfires. There is a whole nother element of cybersecurity, but I will say, at least as of now, that is not a space that we're playing in, although we are having conversations about how that should fit into the work that we do. So we're seeing utilities and regulators right now, like Texas is a great example where in the past couple of years, all of the utilities have had to file resiliency plans to the state commission. And we're seeing that in some other states as well, where for the first time, utilities are being required to develop and file resiliency plans. You know, in some cases, depending on the level of wildfire risk, right, some states' utilities are required either together as part of a broader resiliency plan or independently to file a wildfire mitigation plan. So we're seeing it increase from a sort of policy and utility operation standpoint, but also from a technology and sort of entrepreneurial standpoint. So we're seeing hundreds of companies now that are in this resiliency space. Some of them are companies that have been around for 100 plus years, like the utilities have been, but that are bringing new technologies to market, but also many, many startups in the space that are just seeing the need and bringing new technologies to market. And I would say one of the trends we're seeing is there are a number of companies that have gotten their start focused on wildfire. The need we're hearing from most utilities and regulators is that in order to really justify the return on investment, really looking for solutions that are what we call all hazard or multi-hazard. So some sort of technologies that don't just address wildfire risk, but are also applicable in terms of flood risk and wind risk and extreme cold risk, et cetera. So that's sort of how the landscape is shaping up.
So it sounds like it's mostly still around natural disaster. Are you seeing the issues that we're all talking about now with demand on the grid being so great and concern that this is going to hurt reliability? Is that starting to come into play as well?
Yes, I think that's a separate conversation, but also important context to this conversation. There's a whole nother conversation around sort of resource adequacy and all of the load growth that's happening in order to make sure that we've got the capacity on the system that is needed for the demand and the load growth we're seeing. And there are interplays there with extreme weather and other things that harm the grid. But it is also sort of a separate conversation, right? They can be intertwined, but they can also be two separate conversations.
One is about fixing the technologies or improving the technologies on the grid. And the other is more about finding the resources to supply for the grid.
Yeah, I think that's a good, simple way to explain it. Yeah.
Let me circle back to the utility resilience plans. How do these competitive tech companies treat those plans? Are they kind of like the equivalent of an integrated resource plan to them? Are they looking at these and saying, there's opportunity over here and our technology would work there? Or what do they mean to the industry?
Yeah, no, I think what you just described is accurate in many cases, right? I mean, where there are plans being filed that the utility is describing the attributes of sort of technologies that they're planning to invest in. And therefore, that creates opportunity for the tech companies. And they're looking at those plans and saying, oh, yes, yeah, this utility was describing that they need the attributes that our technology can provide. So they should be a good potential customer for us. I mean, in other cases, it sort of depends on the situation. There are some cases where utilities have already found the technology companies that they think they should be working with. And so they may have already identified technology partners before they even file a plan. And so the plan may be more sort of approval for investment that the utility's already decided who they're going to be partnering with. So it can work both ways. In that latter case, often it's about where the technology company then is helping and partnering with the utility to educate the regulator to make sure that the regulator understands why this is a good investment.
Always that third party that you have to think about when you're in the power industry, the regulator.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the actual technologies, the resilience technologies. Do they fall into certain categories? What's out there?
Oh gosh, there are a bunch of categories. We've actually been working internally on sort of like a landscape mapping, and I don't have it pulled up in front of me and I don't have them all memorized, but there's probably 8 to 10 different categories. I mean, one of the ones that we're watching pretty carefully that we see a growing need around is around weather data. There are a lot of companies that have been around for a long time focused on weather data. And now increasingly, they're bringing those products to the utility market. So that's sort of one category. We're also seeing a lot around essentially what we call situational awareness, right? Technologies that are allowing utilities, for example, AI-enabled cameras. So one of our clients is a company called Pano. They have cameras that are AI-enabled. You put them in high wildfire risk areas, and they're constantly scanning the environment and using AI for very early detection of smoke. And there are lots of great case studies that they're deployed widely with Excel and Portland General Electric and a number of other utilities around the country. But lots of great case studies showing that the Pano cameras have detected smoke and notified all of the relevant parties, both the fire management people plus the utility people, whoever else has been identified as appropriate to get automatic alerts. These cameras are detecting wildfire ignition long before a human ever calls 911 to say that they see smoke, right? And so they're able to get crews there to stop the fire and address the fire and keep it from becoming a catastrophic wildfire that if they had waited for a 911 call from a human, it may have been too late to stop it. So it's just one example of sort of a situational awareness type technology. We're also seeing a lot of other technologies. We work with another company called TechnoSilva. They have a variety of different software tools for utilities, but one very common one is around wildfire spread analysis, so that you can, based on a lot of data sources, including real-time, very localized weather data, know both where your high wildfire risk places are at any given moment, but also know if a wildfire does start at this place at a point in time, based on the weather and the wind and what's happening and the ground conditions, here's what the likely spread is going to be and how long it's going to take. And that means that helps with utilities pre-positioning crews or emergency management, like pre-positioning where you need firefighting forces, et cetera, where you need to be thinking about evacuations. So that's sort of a whole nother category of like all of these software services that are sort of helping both real-time operational decisions, but also decisions around long-term investments, right? Like understanding, using software tools that actually can look at both historical and future forecasted weather patterns to figure out like what equipment should be replaced in what timeframes. And sort of similarly, this sort of takes me to another category is around like vegetation management. That's a really big one because vegetation has a huge role to play in like a lot of, I don't know what the exact number is, but a lot of power outages are caused by trees falling on lines.
I live in rural Virginia in the forest. I know all about the trees.
Yeah. And then also from a wildfire perspective, obviously, this is also very relevant. So the historical way that utilities trim trees and sort of manage vegetation is cyclical. They basically have typically a 3 or 5 year schedule that says, here's a map of our service territory. We're starting at point A. We're going to trim all the trees and just keep going through until we get to the other side. And then we start all over again at point A and keep going until you get to point Z and then start over at point A. Now we're getting to a point where we have technology that is allowing you to be able to move to risk-based vegetation management. And rather than just treating all trees in all places the same, doing analysis based on the species of the tree, how much rain there has been in a certain time period, like actually being able to identify problem trees or
Wow.
hazard trees and say, no, we're going to go trim these trees in this area because that's the highest likelihood of risk to cause an outage. And maybe these other trees in this other place, we're going to trim those once every 5 years. But these trees we're going to trim every year. And these trees we're going to trim every 3 years. And then it may not always be the same trees every year. The cycle changes based on, again, sort of weather patterns and what's happening. So I could go on and on with examples, but there's a lot of different categories. I already mentioned sort of the detection with cameras, but there's also fire suppression technologies. There are a whole category of things around sectionalization of the grid, right? So like I said earlier, you're never going to be able to prevent all outages, but how do you make sure that it impacts the fewest number of people and that it comes back as fast as possible? So all sorts of technologies that allow, if one part of the grid goes down, making sure that the entire grid doesn't go down, and it really sectionalizes it to a much narrower set of customers that are impacted. So like this whole other category.
So many in our audience are microgridders or work in distributed energy. Is that a
Yeah,
category as well?
absolutely.
And how is that doing? I mean, do you feel like that is emerging more as a resilience play?
I think emerging is the right word. I think it is emerging, but it's yet not. I think there's still a lot more potential in the market for those types of solutions. So we're seeing, particularly we're using California as an example, in high wildfire risk areas, we're seeing PG&E and SCE and others say, okay, here's this area that has really high wildfire risk on an ongoing basis. And we, as an example, we did have a fire there and the grid infrastructure was destroyed. Well, rather than rebuilding these power lines to this really high risk area, we're going to put a microgrid there. And that's going to be better for everybody and actually probably be lower cost in the long term. So, that's sort of one piece, I think, of the equation. When we're seeing other utilities like Green Mountain Power in Vermont is a great example, very forward-leaning utility. They're focused on getting utility-owned batteries in every residential customer garage and ensuring that they, as the utility, can use that battery 99.9% of the time to help all customers and sort of help the entire system. But when the power does go out, the customer gets to utilize the battery and they keep their power because they essentially can island and become their own microgrid as an individual building. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. We're starting to see utilities in Texas. CenterPoint has started a pilot probably 4 or 5 years ago that has now become a full-blown program around commercial and industrial customers, focused on very similar in many ways to what I just described for the residential Green Mountain Power program. But essentially, CenterPoint is offering resilience as a service to their C&I customers, where the utility will own the essentially microgrid at the customer site, and the utility uses it most of the time and even pays the C&I customer something monthly for the ability to do that. But again, when the grid does go down, that C&I customer has its own microgrid to make sure that they can keep operating.
Has that resilience. Yeah, yeah. So you're working with all these really interesting companies. This is fascinating. I'm curious, what tends to be the biggest headaches for the startups in this space?
It's hard to say which one's the biggest one. I mean, certainly the length of the utility sales cycle. I mean, for a startup, that is incredibly hard, right? Most startups are funded by venture capital. They're looking for businesses to scale up very quickly and to get their returns on their money. And so, a lot of venture capital firms are very hesitant to invest in businesses that are targeting only utilities as customers because they know it's just going to take too much time to get traction and for the business to actually scale. So that length of the sales cycle really is a challenge that needs to get addressed in order for a lot of these startups to be able to bring these utility solutions to market. Yeah, that's sort of the first thing that comes to mind.
So you're thinking about grid resilience all the time now. What are you worried about in terms of the grid? What keeps you up at night in terms of grid resilience?
Resilience cannot be a one-time investment, right? We can't say we're going to upgrade the grid to make it resilient, and we're going to put all this money in next year over the next 2 or 3 years, and we're done with it. It needs to be a long-term commitment. And that's why Florida Power and Light has been so successful, is because, I talked about how they sort of started down this resilience journey back in 2006, 2007. And it has been a continuous investment for all 20 years since then. And so a lot of utilities are concerned, and this is something the Texas utilities will talk about right now, because they've filed the resilience plans, they've got funding approved to do the initial investments that they need to make the grid more resilient. But they are concerned that the policymakers may not understand that this isn't a once and done. Resilience needs to be an ongoing focus and will require ongoing investment, because the weather is going to keep changing, right? And so the standards for what's needed and new technologies are going to come out to be developed that are even better. And so that is a big concern, is that there's going to be sort of this short-term focus on resiliency, but it may not be sustained in the way that it needs to be in order to make sure that customers are really getting the level of resiliency that they need as we go forward. I think the other concern, and it's part of the reason why I came up with this idea for this Power Resilience Forum and launched the event this year, was going back to your question. We're talking about like the fact that what's happening is just all of this load growth, data centers, AI. There's such a need for power in a way that there has not been in a very long time in our country. And that conversation is very important, but it's been sucking the air out of every conference and every dialogue and every conversation. It's all anybody's been talking about. And so a big concern I've had was that that issue was very much overshadowing the really important conversation about investing in the grid for resiliency. And that was part of the reason why I created this Power Resilience Forum, was to have a dedicated place where we were not talking about data centers and AI and load growth. We were talking about grid resilience and what investment is needed in the grid to address these issues. So that was a big up at night issue for me over the past couple of years, was that just I felt like this conversation about resiliency was getting crowded out.
Yes, it's definitely that the AI conversation is crowding out all the other conversations right
Yeah.
now. But the resilience companies and the utilities are very lucky to have you doing the work you're doing right now. And I think you're going to be really busy for quite a while.
I hope so.
I appreciate you coming on the show and talking about resilience, and best of luck to you in all this great work.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.